in abundance, but from those who have nothing, even what they have will be given away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
One evening, a long time ago, during my seminary days, I was sitting on the back porch at my friend Nancy's house. We were in the middle of our weekly ritual of drinking a little wine and eating nachos and having our usual casual conversation, when suddenly Nancy became quite serious and announced that she just couldn't understand some of the parables Jesus told. Well, I saw this as my golden opportunity to put my biblical studies and theological reflection skills to good use. I asked Nancy which of the parables she found so confusing. I was all set to help her out, thinking this would be great. I could help a friend unlock some of the puzzling parts of Scripture. Anyway, just as I was mentally giving myself a pat on the back, Nancy declared that she just couldn't figure out the parable of the talents. The what? I asked. The talents, Nancy replied. You know, those claws that eagles and hawks have. Why would Jesus talk about talents anyway? That's when my bubble burst. It was all I could do not to spit out the sip of wine I had just swallowed. Talents? Jesus didn't tell a story about talents. It's talents he talked about. Talents, money, that's the story Jesus told. Needless to say, that's as far as we got that evening, because both of us couldn't stop laughing. The laughter came in waves, and as we drank a little more wine and nibbled at those nachos, I have to tell you I never did get around to talking about this parable. And so now you're going to have to endure the great explanation I had planned so many years ago. Are you ready? Talents or talents? It really doesn't matter when it comes to unraveling this story. Either way, it's quite puzzling, especially for those of us in the 21st century. We should know by now, Jesus' parables or stories were usually filled with hyperbole and exaggeration. That's how he managed to get people to listen and pay attention. This is just that sort of story. Now then, if you had been around in the days of first century Palestine, it might have been easier to understand at least part of this story. In the first place, in those days, people believed that all goods existed and were already distributed. The only way to get more was to defraud someone. In other words, anyone who became suddenly wealthy must be a thief. And it was fairly common that wealthy people sometimes traveled great distances for long periods of time. While wealthy folk were on the road, they often gave their servants added responsibility for running things. Now, just so that we understand the money part of the story, one single talent was a huge amount of money. Generally speaking, a single talent was the equivalent of 15 years' wages for the ordinary person. So for a wealthy person in today's story to distribute 5 talents to servant number 1, 2 talents to servant number 2, and even that single talent to servant number 3, that meant these guys had hit it big time. Think in terms of the largest lotto jackpot ever. Okay, so now you have some background information to get you through this story. Remember how I told you that Jesus loved hyperbole. Are you getting that? So, here's how it happened. It seems that somehow servant number 1 was able to double his money by making 5 more talents. Remember, folks assumed this guy had to be a thief in biblical proportions, so to speak. Servant number 2 managed to double his holdings as well. Another scoundrel added to the list. Servant number 3 did the wise thing in people's eyes. He did the prudent thing, the safe thing. In those days, burying money was considered to be a wise investment. It was safe, secure, and ensured that no one would be stealing the wealth. So far, so good? Now, the rich man comes home from his travels and wants to settle accounts with the servant. The first and second servant proudly display the added wealth they have managed to accumulate. Now, mind you, the folks who heard this story were thinking that these guys were bad guys because they must have added to the wealth by cheating and deception. But wait a minute. Instead of the wealthy man scolding and denouncing the two servants, he praises them for their initiative and imagination, not to mention their willingness to risk everything. On the other hand, the third servant, timidly, in fear and with great trepidation, presents the original talent, but nothing more. At this point, he must have realized that he was in trouble. But then, after all, as far as the listeners to this story were concerned, this guy did the wise and prudent thing. It just wasn't smart to stick your neck out and take any chances. But, and here's the part where Jesus turned the whole thing upside down. It turns out that the rich man was furious with servant number 3. He screams and yells at him, tells him he is lazy and useless. And on top of that, he takes that 1 talent and gives it to the one who now has 10 talents. This poor guy is worthless. Now, just what in the world did Jesus expect the people who heard this story so long ago, and not to mention us in the 21st century, what are we expected to do with this? Well, let me suggest something to you. Maybe, just maybe, this is a story about being held accountable. What if this story is all about being judged someday? What if this story is all about asking ourselves, as God may be asking us, what have you done with what you have been given? That's what William Willem, an author, professor, and theologian, asks. He goes on to say, what if this isn't a story about stewardship or our special gifts and talents? And it's true, we all have marvelous gifts and talents. But what if this is all about sticking our necks out and risking ourselves in order to share our abundant gifts with others in ways we may never have thought about? What if this is a story about God asking us, what have you done with what you have been given? And that's not an easy question for any of us to answer. But think about it. Someday that very well may be the question. What have you done with what you have been given? Okay, so now here's another version of the story that's written by a young woman who sees herself without anything worthwhile to offer the world. The storyteller begins, I'm writing a novel. I know you find that hard to believe considering I'm so young, and since and my teacher doesn't call me that either, but I know it, and that's all that counts. I'm calling the novel The Curse of the Gifted Sisters. In the book, there is a family with 3 daughters, kind of like ours, she says. The first daughter is really smart. The second daughter is really good at sports. The third daughter is not really good at anything. The third daughter is the one who's telling the story. The first daughter, that is, the oldest, makes straight A's from first grade through high school. She's in all the gifted classes and goes to special schools for gifted kids. Every time people come over to her house, her parents want her to play the piano, which she's really good at doing. She's a member of every honor society you've ever heard of. She goes to an Ivy League college, and to top it off, they give her a full academic scholarship. To make things worse, she's really pretty, and is always doing nice things for people. In other words, she's the kind of sister who would be easy to hate. The second daughter is not as smart as the first, but she does pretty well in school. She isn't gifted or anything, but she makes good grades and stays out of trouble. All in all, she's pretty ordinary, except when it comes to sports. When she was just a kid, she was on the soccer team and softball team in the neighborhood. Then when she gets to high school, she plays basketball in the fall and runs track in the spring. Then she plays softball in the summer. Her room is so full of trophies that she has to step over them and hang her clothes on them just to have room to move. Even though she's still in high school, colleges are sending people to watch her play, and it looks like she's going to have her pick of athletic scholarships. She's another sister easy to hate. Then there is the youngest daughter, who is not really good at anything. She doesn't make good grades. She tried for a while and made mostly B's and C's with an A mixed in occasionally. Finally, she just quit trying. She could never live up to her gifted sister, so why even bother? She's not very good at sports either. She tried just about everything: soccer, softball, basketball, and track, and she's a klutz. Compared to her sister, she looks like an old lady out there trying to play soccer or basketball, but she didn't like to practice, so she quit. She was pretty good at playing the clarinet, which is something neither of her sisters could play, but she didn't like to practice that either, so she quit. Sometimes I wonder if she really hates to practice, or if she's just scared that she'll never be really good, even if she did practice. Her teacher tells her she has a great imagination, but she just needs more discipline. And she does like to write stories, like this novel about her mean sister. Her parents say she's not living up to her potential. How do they know what kind of potential she has? They're too busy taking her sister to visit colleges and to games and award banquets. What do they know about their stupid daughter, the one who isn't gifted? So this younger sister is going to run away. That will make them all really sorry. Or maybe it won't. Maybe they'll all be glad she's gone. Anyway, she's going to write this novel about her sisters, if she ever gets it together. I think that some of us might see ourselves somewhere in this version of the story. And I like to imagine that our writer has taken the risk to use her imagination to write the novels she plans. The third servant in Jesus' story today may have had something to offer, but his fear of failure kept him from using what he did have. It was much safer just to bury his gift and not take any chances. Now that may sound familiar to us. I think we all have times in our lives when it just doesn't make sense for us to risk what we have. It seems much safer for us to just hold on to our gifts. Jesus is telling us that even though doing nothing sounds safe and secure, it's not what God expects from us. This morning's story was told at a time when Jesus realm. Last week, we heard from the Apostle Paul writing to the young church in Thessalonica. You might remember that the members of the congregation were struggling as they impatiently waited for the coming of Christ once again. Paul tried to encourage the believers to hold on and have faith and to believe that Christ was truly in their midst, guiding and leading the small congregation. Paul wrote, "Don't give up. The time of Christ's second arrival isn't what counts. What does matter," Paul wrote, "is that we are to help one another, reach out, offer encouragement, especially to those who may think they have very little to give." Paul tells the young church to take the risk that comes along with being faithful as people of Christ. Here's the thing. At one time or another, we have all been faced with taking risks in our lives. We've risked relationships. We've risked jobs and careers. We've risked moving from places of safety to moving forward that might just seem too risky. What about where we are now? Are we becoming complacent? Are we telling ourselves that moving forward just isn't safe? Remember, here's the question today. What have you done with what you have been given? Catherine Huey, a UCC pastor, puts it this way: how often do we choose to bury our faith, our relationship with God, the gospel itself, or at least tuck it away somewhere in a hidden place and just take it out on Sundays and emergency situations? How much better if our whole life were affected, changed, transformed by living out our faith, by responding every day to the call of the still speaking God. So what are we going to do with what we've been given? We've been called as a community of faith and gospel to spend what we have been given, to share our abundance, and spend ourselves as followers of Christ. So go ahead, stick your neck out, take a chance, risk yourself for God's sake. After all,